Francisco d'Antonio.
Watching, we know you exist.
Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah viewers. Today we're very fortunate to have Sheikh Alamgir Ali with us in the studio to discuss a very pressing issue and a very important one in the current climate, in current times, the position or the view of Islam on politics, and does Islam have a political philosophy? It should be fascinating to hear his views. Assalamu alaikum, Alamgir. You've written a short piece which is available on the Face-to-Face website, where you introduce the idea about an Islamic political philosophy. If we start off on some simple ideas and terms to help the viewers kind of get some perspective. A lot of people probably familiar with the idea of politics, just in the way they kind of experience it, even if they haven't studied it. Is there an equivalent idea, an equivalent term in Arabic? How are they linked? Would you please explain something to the viewers?
If you look at the word politics, politics really just refers to the process of governance, of how a person is to, or how a society, a collective body, essentially is ruled by, how people appoint their rulers and how they are governed as a collective unit and as a collective whole. So this process of governing people and taking care of people's affairs is something that we do see within our religion. Some scholars and theorists, they like to translate the term politics as siyasa into Arabic.
Okay.
Now, if you look carefully at the word siyasa, it's not a word that exists within the Quran. It's not used in its base form or as a derivative. It's not used. We do find it in a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet said that كانت بنو إسرائيل تسوسهم أنبياؤهم, that Banu Israel, they used to be led by their prophets. And so the verb sasa yasusu has a meaning of leading or taking care, tadbir, of organizing people's affairs. So, it's a concept that we can see existed. The Prophet spoke about it, Banu Israel being led by their prophet. So this concept of leadership, we can see clearly it's there within our heritage. The Prophet ﷺ was a leader of an entire state, we can say. He was a leader of a community. So other than being a prophet, he was also a leader of a nation.
Okay.
So we can clearly see that there are similarities between both concepts of politics and siyasa. I suppose we can say that siyasa is an approximate term for politics.
Right. So is it a translation then of a later translation from finding an equivalent for the European English term?
Yeah, I suppose we can say that.
So the concept existed.
Yeah.
There was politics going on.
Absolutely.
In Muslim society, Muslim community from the beginning.
That's right.
But the term, there wasn't an equivalent term at that time, and later on the Muslim scholars looked at the term in Western culture, and then found an equivalent.
Yeah.
So it approximates to.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
However, if you look to the history of politics in Europe, naturally, the nature of politics has changed throughout the years.
Right.
In the past, people would live in very sort of excluded societies, and in Arabia, for example, it was like tribal communities.
Right.
And so it wasn't like a modern state, for example.
Okay.
Whereas the concept of a modern state is relatively new.
Right.
And it's something which is quite, it has the marks of European politics, if you can say.
Okay.
But nevertheless, there are still a lot of similarities.
Right. Have there been any sort of has there been any theoretical writing? Have scholars from the Muslim community written about the ideas about governance, making laws, how communities should work together, or the kind of concepts that we're familiar with in the West? Who has authority? Where does it belong?
Yeah.
are there such sort of
Yeah,
writings in the
absolutely.
Islamic tradition?
I mean, the concept of Islamic politics, it was never a separate genre in Islamic literature.
Okay.
And that's due to a number of reasons. One, because I think that the classical manuals of Islamic law, in many cases, incorporated a lot of the political concepts within our religion. But having said that, there were works that were written by old traditional scholars, focusing specifically on those, political aspects related to governance. So we have, for example, Ahkam al-Sultaniya, the rules of the Sultanate, for example, by Imam al-Mawardi. And there was other scholars that wrote exactly the same title, for example, Qadi Abu Ya'la, Farra al-Hanbali. Other scholars, Imam al-Haramain, Ghiyath al-Umam, etc. So there are a number of scholars, Ibn Taymiyyah as well, Siyasat Shari'iyya, that wrote about the concept of there being an imam that is to be appointed, who is there in order to govern people's affairs. And that was if you look at all the various different books that were written on this topic, they mainly begin with that topic.
Okay.
The imam.
Right.
Who is the imam?
Who is leading the community?
Who is leading the community? How is to be appointed? Are there any stipulations behind that imam? What happens if he is removed? How is he to be removed? What happens if he doesn't fulfill the conditions, for example? Which is a very interesting chapter, I think, within some of the books that were written. For example, in Ghiyath al-Umam, a lot of attention is given to what happens if the imam doesn't fulfill the conditions of the imam, which shows you how a lot of the political theorists and those scholars that wrote about the imamate were pragmatists in a way, in the sense that they dealt with the situation. They realized, look, there's going to be times where a lot of these stipulations might not be met, so we have to deal with those sort of situations.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Well, so it seems then clearly that in terms of the classical tradition, scholars wrote extensively about leadership of the community and the various different frameworks and situations in which that needed to be worked out. Here, I guess, for Muslims growing up in the West, when they think of politics, they often associate with the idea of how to decide collectively how they should be governed collectively. What laws should regulate their own actions. And for people in the UK, of course, they're familiar with that happening through a parliamentary process. In Islam, I guess also our viewers will have the alternate idea that the Quran has come down as Allah's legislation.
Yeah.
How do those two things come together? Does the Quran speak about everything?
Yeah.
Where it doesn't, possibly. What is the scope for Muslims to come together and collectively decide how to govern it? If you could say some words that would...
I think clearly Islam teaches us that the revelation itself, the Quran, it gives us guidance regarding all aspects of life. Tibyan li kulli shay. It clarifies matters relating to all aspects of life, and I think that's very clear if we look to the teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah. In certain cases, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us very detailed laws, and we find that in the Sunnah as well. For example, in acts of worship, in terms of praying and fasting, etc., we have very, very detailed laws. In many other cases, we have guidelines, you can say, in terms of how we are to do certain matters. And I think in certain regards, when it comes to governance, a lot of the scriptures and texts that speak about governance are quite general, in the sense that they don't provide specifics.
Okay.
So I mean, just take for example the fact about the manner in which we appoint a ruler. I mean, it's interesting to note that the first four khulafa were all appointed very differently.
Right. Okay. Yes.
And which indicates that that the Sharia left maybe this open for the people.
There isn't a hard and fast, particularly sort of stipulated, textually stipulated, whether it has to be done precisely like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
But at the same time, it does provide guidelines.
So it provides general guidelines,
Yeah.
and within the framework of those guidelines.
Yes.
So
Right.
how far does that go then? I mean, are there within the scope of those guidelines, those parameters perhaps that have been laid down, can Muslims come together, and can they decide to regulate themselves, collectively agree to a set of rules by which they have to abide, even though they aren't mentioned exactly or specifically in the Quran or Sunnah?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to look to the situation of the Muslims at that time. Are they living in a situation, for example, where they have the freedom to choose for themselves what they are to be ruled by?
Okay.
Or are they living as a minority, for example?
Right.
So, I mean, if we look at, for example, the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, we saw how in Mecca, he lived you can say the Muslim community lived as a minority.
Right.
They couldn't influence maybe the political leadership in terms of how the society should be governed.
Right.
Whereas when they went to Medina, they had that support from the people, and so they were able to collectively decide what they should be governed by. So I think for Muslims here in the West, I think it's a very different scenario to say Muslims in the Muslim world, for example.
Right.
In some cases anyway. So I think for us as Muslims here, our to have an aim, for example, that we want to be governed by the Sharia here in the UK, I think it's nonsensical from a number of perspectives. I mean, the desire and the wish for that is great. I mean, we all want to be governed by the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Right.
But
as a point of faith.
Yeah. As a point of faith.
But you're talking sort of in terms of an immediate, achievable objective.
Exactly. And I think, our objective is not just to see certain laws to be implemented. Our objective is to see people willingly submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Okay.
And so that happens organically.
Yeah.
It's not something which is enforced upon people like that. And that's why I think that our purpose in life is to draw closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I don't think that can be enforced upon people.
Right.
I think that people have to organically reach that state, and that is what the Prophet ﷺ did. In
right.
Medina.
So it matches the prophetic pattern anyway.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right. Okay. MashaAllah. I mean, perhaps if we move from the position in the UK to the Muslim world, very quickly, if you could, sort of say something about the tension between the monarchies or the autocracies in the Muslim world and the desire for a democratic rule. I mean, I think many viewers will have seen the Arab Spring, and then how that sort of almost went backwards.
Yeah.
Does Islam have a position on that? Is there?
Yeah, I mean, I think a saying of Ali radiallahu anh comes to mind, that كيفما تكون الأمة تكون الولاة, that however the ummah is, that is how their rulers will be.
Okay.
And I think that the desire for change within the Muslim ummah is, we appreciate that, we understand that, and that sentiment, I think, is something that we all feel. However, that sentiment has to have some sort of guidance behind it, and divine guidance, really. And we don't just want change for the sake of change. Muslims need to have a clear vision of what they want.
Right.
And suffering from years of oppression and dictatorship, I think it's natural that people yearn for a sense of freedom, from the shackles of dictatorship and what have you. But then, I think we need to, as a Muslim ummah, we need to sort of challenge that desire to something which falls in line with the Quran,
Sharia.
with the Sharia.
Jazakallah khair. Alamgir, in the last segment, you speaking on the idea of how Muslim laws, how do Muslims derive their laws, or how do they decide how by what laws they should be governed? And you explained to us the idea that the fundamental concept is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala legislates, that the Quran has a mixture of very specific laws and more general guidance. And in terms of what we normally think of politics and the way society is governed, that those are not covered by very many specific guidelines, but more wide-ranging parameters. And then you expanded and said that within that framework, Muslims can come together and there is the potential for them, at least, to collectively decide on matters. If we could expand on that a bit, is there not a danger then? At least I know in some Muslims' minds there will be sort of a warning bell going off. That sounds a lot like Muslims actually ruling by other than what Allah has revealed. So Muslims setting themselves up as legislators, whereas Allah is the only legislator.
I don't think there's any contradiction between the two. It's to say that Muslims can legislate in those areas where the Sharia has given us general principles and guidelines, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being the legislator. If you look at the nature of modern day politics and the infrastructure of a modern state, you'll find that most of its laws are administrative by nature.
Right.
How to administer, a government, for example, and how for example, a member of parliament, how they pass, laws, for example, and how they deal with the constituencies, etc. So I think a lot of the laws are administrative by nature, and then these are matters which clearly we find in many cases the Quran and Sunnah hasn't given us detailed laws regarding. So in situations like that, I think it's fine for Muslims to come together, for people to decide for themselves at the end of the day what is good for them.
Is there some scholarly basis for this? Is there some scholarly basis for these rules which are just administrative, haven't been directly stated in the Quran, for Muslims to sort of effectively decide them collectively as a community? Is there some basis for you making this comment?
I mean, if you look to how the scholars, when they spoke about usul al-fiqh and they spoke about the concept of maslaha al-mursala, for example, benefit or welfare for the common good of the people. Scholars have spoken about this topic, and many scholars were of the view that rulings can be passed in favor of the general welfare of the people on condition that maslaha and that welfare hasn't been negated, by the.
So,
by
for
the
example,
Sharia.
if a community were to institute a number of statutes about building regulations. This isn't. You're saying this isn't hukum bighayri ma anzal. This isn't ruling by other than what God has revealed.
As long as it doesn't contradict. I mean, there are, for example, if you look at our fiqh manuals, there are actually some discussions about the height of buildings, how high they should be, if it overlooks another person's garden or private property, for example.
Right.
There are hadith pertaining to that. But as long as these statutes do not contradict principles within our Sharia or contradict any particular text, then
what about the idea of then democracy? You briefly commented on the situation in the Muslim world. About Muslims aspiring to have a more involved way in which they rule themselves, and to sort of often, many of them having been oppressed, throw off the shackles of tyranny. Is it okay for them to replace that with democracy? Is that acceptable? Because again, I think perhaps some people might have thought you said, okay, that's understandable. Is that understandable? Or I mean, is it acceptable?
I think it depends how you view the concept of democracy. First, you have to look at the sentiments of the people. When they call for democracy, what are they calling for? They're calling for themselves to be essentially released from these oppressive regimes, so they can decide for themselves essentially who they want to appoint. The way I see it is that for a number of Muslims, this might not be the case for all Muslims, but they aspire for democracy because they see it as a mechanism that will, aid their interests, rather than a Western ideology. That's obviously how a number of people view democracy. They see it as an ideology which completely is at contrast with our deen. Others see it, for example, as just a mechanism of how to appoint a ruler.
Are you not saying? I mean, just for some extra clarity there, that this again, I think it's the possibility that some would worry this is a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Is there a distinction? I mean, are you creating an artificial distinction once you accept the concept of democracy? Is it not just one? It's either all or nothing. How can you have democracy?
Obviously, this is a very sensitive topic, and I think there is a lot of blanket statements that are passed by people that are in favor of democracy and those who are against democracy. For many people, they see as in a very black and white way. They say democracy, if it means being ruled by the people, these rulers are being appointed by the people, and the rules are decided by the people. Then it's as if you're putting Allah Subhanahu wa Taala and the Sharia to the side. That's one way you can look at it. And if a person,
so surely in that case, then we can't allow democracy full stop.
No, it depends. It depends. It depends what you mean by democracy. If you mean by democracy a mechanism by which you choose your rulers, you choose the system of governance, then in certain situations that's something that we need. In fact, in the Muslim world, I mean, take for example, just say for example that Syria is liberated from Assad. Just say Syria is liberated by Assad. And the overall sentiment of the people is that they want to be ruled by an Islamic governance, for example. The only way they can achieve that is if they clearly manifest that their support for that, and that clearly stating that this is the will of the people. How can this be against the will of God? How can this be against our Deen?
There are some groups in the Muslim world that do.
Yeah.
Accept this view of Islam, that it is acceptable, and they work to a program to try to achieve this. They're often termed here in the West as Islamists, or people who believe in a political program for Islam. Would you care to say something more about that? What does the term Islamism mean, and is it really the same as Islam? Is it not actually adding a further element to the Islamic faith? Is adding politics in to Islam when there isn't any connection between the two?
I mean, one thing we have to acknowledge first is that Islamism is a relatively newly is a new phrase, newly turned term, a new term. I think it resulted from there being a clear sort of distinct movement within the Muslim ummah, within the Muslim world, where we saw a collection of organization groups and parties that sort of demanded the restoration of an Islamic caliphate, or where people expressed a vision to have Islam essentially guide all of our spheres in life. So, I mean, that's how some people interpret Islamism, as a desire to see Islam govern all aspects of life. Some, interpret it to mean that it's enforcing a particular version of Islam upon others. The danger is using these terms and making it distinct from Islam. It will make people think that Islamism is something which is alien to Islam. And that's how it's being portrayed, that you have something which is called Islam and something which is called Islamism. And there are obviously other connotations attached to...
Are the two things not separate? Yeah.
Well, I think clearly there is a connection between the two. And I think in many cases, Islamism actually represents a very traditional, orthodox understanding of the religion. For example, the desire a Muslim might have to see Islam govern all aspects of his life. To say that is something other than Islam, I think it's wrong. However, how that desire is manifested, then that opens a whole can of worms, essentially.
Can such a political program ever be achieved through peaceful means, through the means of the ballot box in the Muslim world? Again, you've said how you don't believe it to be a feasible objective here in the West, in the Muslim world. Should they be doing that? Should they not be aspiring to a model of taking over these countries and and implementing without choice
Yeah.
Islam?
Well,
Is that not the proper way to
I
do
never
it?
said that it shouldn't be our wish for for the Muslims here in the West. Ideally, a Muslim would like to see Islam, for example, governing our affairs here, even in the West. However, the way we do that, this is my question that I'm trying to raise here. I
You
mentioned,
said you hear that, it's a desire, but not something
Yeah.
that's an immediate objective. Where we're
Yeah.
seeing as a more realistic goal, or where the situation is more fluid
Yeah.
in the Muslim world, and where there is a majority in the first place anyway
Yeah.
of Muslims actually residing there.
yeah,
A political program, can it be achieved through the ballot box, through
Yeah.
voting, or does that not need to be put to one side
Yeah.
and some kind of forceful military
Yeah.
takeover of those societies where there is no choice given to whether you choose to live by God's law, whether you choose to live by the Quran or not? It's imposed.
Yeah.
And shouldn't those Muslims, genuinely attached to the faith, be working to impose it on the rest of their fellow believers?
As I mentioned before, the way the Prophet ﷺ, ascended to leadership in Medina, it was through an organic process. It wasn't something that simply happened overnight. When the Prophet ﷺ stepped into Medina, the people accepted him. And they were willing to listen to him.
Are you saying there have been some preliminary steps that have
There were
already
preliminary
occurred?
steps, yeah. So when the tribes would come to visit the Prophet ﷺ, the delegations used to come to the Prophet ﷺ, he would teach them Islam. And
So
he
it
would,
wasn't a coup. There wasn't a coup then.
well, I mean, some people like to call it a coup. I don't think it was a coup.
Right.
A coup is a very sort of modern phenomenon.
Right.
Clearly, what happened at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, tribes came to the Prophet ﷺ, they embraced Islam and they went back to Medina and they spread Islam to the inhabitants of Medina. So, likewise, in the Muslim world today, if there is to be change, I believe it is done in an organic manner where people naturally accept it. This is and this becomes the wish of the overall masses. And the same would happen here. I believe that if Islam ever was to come to power here, it will be through a democratic process, in the sense that it will represent the wish of the people.
A gradual process.
A gradual process.
Okay. If we sort of speak a little bit more about that idea, then you've brought the conversation back to the West and about engaging in the community. People in society generally here view politics in a very negative way. It's come to have a lot of negative perceptions building up around it. What do you think our faith teaches us about engaging in the political process versus disengaging in it? Should we engage or shouldn't we?
I think people obviously there's a lot of negative stigma attached to politics, and for right reasons, due to the corruption that we see, etc.
Isn't it un-Islamic? Full stop.
Why would someone argue that it's un-Islamic?
Because it's a corrupt and it's a corrupt process. It's a process which leads you to compromise.
Yeah, I think in many regards, yes, but at the same time, if there is corruption there, then that's more of a reason to try and to reform the system. So
Jazakallah khair, Alamgir, for coming in, for discussing your essay and discussing the ideas. I hope the viewers listening today enjoyed the discussion and that they gained some benefit and some insights from what Sheikh Alamgir was explaining. All of the viewers can go back to the website, read his article to get more insight into the issue. They're also welcome to read many of the other articles that are available on that site. There will be future programs and future episodes that will be building on some of those essays and some of those thought pieces. I hope you'll come back and join us for those discussions. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.